Thanks, Cheryl, and thanks for coming. I should mention I'm teaching this quarter, so I'll be actually rushing off to talk another hour in my class. But Adrian Aris actually sitting in the back. I know he'll be around a little bit longer. And at the end, I actually make a point of highlighting my email if you have any questions that we don't get to today. I'd like to get your feedback. So I want to cover a few things today about early cereal vegetation. First, kind of make a distinction between the structure, composition, and legacies, and then talk about management of vegetation, kind of tying into Tom's idea of stand replacing disturbances and then after partial disturbances. And I should mention, I'm going to stick with vegetation on that. So when I talk about, I don't necessarily have really thought about and don't have the data for the follow-up stuff, what it means for insects, for wildlife, and other aspects. Obviously, Joan and Matt Batts have been thinking about that a lot more. So I'll really focus today on managing the vegetation itself, or the vegetation component of the ecosystem. So first, actually, just a simple thing. I changed this actually when I listened to Tom this morning, and put in that the definition of an early cereal forest is really the conditions created by disturbance, and a disturbance that removes the overstory on that. And in that sense, I guess, well, the 20% was a cutoff suggested. I'll talk a little bit later about how some spatial aspects come into that game as well. So in many ways, actually, well, natural disturbances and even forest management, certainly maybe in the 70s and 80s, we've been pretty good at creating early cereal forests, especially some of those shrub fields in Northern California. That was pretty impressive forest management, and I don't think we knew that that was the target at the time. But now looking back, of course, that was a big impact with the regeneration failures. But I really want to make that distinction that Joan already highlighted and focusing on the structure. There's a structural component to the early cereal forest and to the vegetation, and that's really given that open space, allowing light to come very low to the ground, allowing space for insects or flying animals, as well as allowing space and growing space for establishment of new vegetation, but also growth of that new vegetation. And of course, what's happening over time, as already pointed out, we have a shift to the tall canopy layers, which in most of our forests here really means conifer-dominated forests. And it's important for me to distinguish that from the compositional aspect of early cereal vegetation. That's really vegetation. That's really where we're looking at which species are there on that. And we have, of course, over time, a shift towards late cereal vegetation. But I should point out, actually, some of our studies where we kind of separate that. We have that shift in the canopy layers. So in the herb layer, we have that shift in the shrub layer, and we have that shift in the tree layer on that. And the structure and composition are not the same. And when we manage them, we don't necessarily manage them the same. So when we think about managing for early cereal forests, to me, it's very important to go to that level of detail and think about, are we interested in structure? Are we interested in composition, or what kind of mixture and what kind of relative importance? The one thing that's already gotten some attention is really the legacies from the pre-disturbance forest that is carried over, and I'm just going to keep the legacy component rather short. Clearly, legacies, we leave them because they're important for ecosystem processes and functions. And if you don't believe that, snags, I guess, or burned trees have an impact in terms of erosion, maybe this picture can convince you that there is a benefit of leaving those trees on the ground. It keeps the rocks up on the hill on that. But they also have an impact on the vegetation development on that. And when you think about it in terms of, certainly hardwoods and some of the shrubs, the sprouting, for conifers in the upper forest, you'd see the seed source. And those factors really accelerate, in many ways, the development towards late cereal forests on that. I mean, that's part of the natural system, too. So if you think about that, when we leave legacies, we need to think about their components for the ecosystem, the benefit as part of the early cereal forest, but also its impact on the development of that vegetation. And of course, if you leave too many legacies, you don't get enough disturbance. I guess if I don't stick with the 20%, some of the legacies can really even slow down the development and even maybe in some cases even prevent establishment of early xerovegetation. So again, if you think about leaving legacies in an early xeral context, maybe in any context, we should really look at the full suite of aspects that are affected by these legacies, and in many cases, at least, the legacies we leave behind accelerate the development of late xeral vegetation and therefore shorten that early xeral phase. So we have to deal with trade-offs. So how long do they last in a managed context? This is a study that Mark Harmon and one of his students put together a few years back. And so you can see over time here on the Sayuzla National Forest and on the right side, the Willamette National Forest, the conifer cover and their plantations on that. So a lot of these, I have to admit, are older. Some of these are actually younger. They extrapolate them out to 50 years. So these are not all plantations established 50 years ago. These are the plantations from 50 years ago till the 1980s, when the kind of plantation phase ended for the Forest Service. So what you see here, that even with best management efforts, at least at the time, you have a wide variety of speed of development on that. You know, some stands were 80-90% conifer covered. This is taken from an air photo, I guess from the sky. Within a decade or 12, 15 years, while other ones were, after 50 years, barely half covered in conifers on that. And of course, you have that same spread on both sides, maybe more spread on the Willamette. Now, I don't know what that means for the Willamette, that it goes down. Maybe you were ahead of the curve and maintained the early xeral vegetation longer. Maybe it means that this regeneration wasn't that successful at the time. So this is what you typically see in some of these plantations. Actually, I took these photos on ODF land up in the Coast Range. You have the first few years, you know, even after weed control, you do have some early xeral vegetation, but very quickly the site is dominated by the conifers, and then I guess as the ultimate epitome, if you want to call it that, you have that stem exclusion phase where you have very little understory vegetation underneath, or in this case, actually, I pulled out the picture because it's basically none. As an alternative, or I guess as another extreme, we have some stands, in this case, some snowbrush dominated fields here, where the development has been arrested, so to speak, where we've had very slow development towards later xeral structure and composition, for that matter. I think if you look closely, you can see a few conifers poking their head through. I guess if down here, but some of these, shrub fields can be there for quite a while. We probably could have something similar on some coastal sides when you think about maybe the samberry in some of those sides as the alder dies out and becomes established. But for quite a while, for a decade or two or even three or more, you have early xeral conditions, at least in terms of structure. You don't have that conifer cover on that. Whether the composition, the species composition, is still early xeral depends on the legacies that drive that development, obviously. I want to just focus in a little bit more on the legacies, and again, focusing the legacy discussion here on the impact they have on vegetation. And this is from a study down in Timbered Rock area and in southern Oregon. And so after the second growing season, after fire, up in the middle, you see the site is dominated by, actually early on we had a lot of bryophytes really dominating the site as the first phase. And then over time, how quickly they developed through the phase really depends on the legacies. So where we had hardwoods and dense hardwood cover here down to the right, they morphed fairly quickly within a few years, at least to a shrub layer and shrub layer cover on that. If we didn't have that, we maintained some low vegetation on the ground, I guess some ferns, and still some mosses that stuck around in this kind of settings for a while on that. So the legacies in that sense, drove the development, how quickly, at least to the level of the shrub canopy layer, the growing space filled in and the vegetation, I guess, shifted. And in this case, as part of the study, we planted trees in some pots, and on the left here you see a side where we did the shrub removal, 3 years of cutting around the seedlings. On the right, you see no treatment on that, and really kind of pointing out how this type of management to encourage conifer growth arrests that dominance of that shrub layer, kind of sets that legacy back on that. I know we've heard that legacy are a lot of good things. In this case, if you want to keep it open, the legacy is kind of counteracting that trend. And that's the point I want to make. So at least initially, when you look at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, the legacies seem to be accelerating that trend away from that open space. And the standard treatment, in this case, I guess standard for the BLM down there, of mechanical shrub removal is maintaining things more open. But of course that changes then over time. On that, you'll have to look at the dynamics. This is one of Tim Harrington's pictures. In the middle here you see one of the plots where at age 2 they did fairly intensive hardwood control. And so that initial open structure benefited the conifers. So within a decade or two you have this removal where you do keep things open, where you remove the legacies, you have a quicker development towards the conifer dominance on that. So over time, some of our practices keep that initial opening there, which then, at least in this case, benefits the conifers and moves along to the dominance of conifers on that. So they have kind of a dual role, I guess, to play in this kind of setting. Switching to, I guess, some of the fire-dominated systems down south, I just want to highlight a few things for natural development. I know Tom mentioned that before, but this kind of pointing out that if you don't have any management at all, there is enough open space, especially on those dry sites and lower, I guess, with the lower site index, lower conifer growth potential, that after 5, 10, or even 20 years, we see seedlings that are able to establish, and I guess this number of seedlings here, make it a dominance above the shrub layer on that. So this is coming into fires about 20 years later and looking at when did this dominant seedlings established, and they didn't establish in a 1 or 2 or 3 year time frame. So there was enough open growing space, one of the definitions I use for early cereal conditions, to allow establishment of new vegetation on that. And this is not limited necessarily to the dry forest down south. I think even the Cummins Creek study here out on the Coast Range showed a fairly lengthy interval, actually some other studies on the Coast Range too, fairly lengthy interval when new trees established that 150 years later you would probably assign to that same cohort, or you will assign to that same cohort. So thinking about in the natural systems, we do have this variability, we do have these open spaces that stick around for quite a while. If you contrast that to some of our managed settings, Adrian said the black background was spooky. I guess he was right on that. This is comparing stands down in southern Oregon, northern California, that had been managed, and again the management was salvage, fuel treatments, planting, but no chemical but mechanical release. And what you see on this graph, clearly the green, the left bar is the unmanaged forest, the blue bar, the managed forest, and you see a shift in size distribution on that. And to me, two interesting things. Of course, the big trees benefit, or quite a few conifers benefit from it. So you'll see more bigger trees in the managed forest, but you see more smaller trees in the unmanaged forest. Again, hinting that there is a time delay in establishment on that. You don't have as many big trees dominating. There is still some open space for new trees to come in, even though we don't have tree ages, but it seems to kind of support that trend on that. The other thing that it points out, actually the study pointed out, which is pretty important, is the idea of spatial evenness on that. The big difference in terms of the conditions here 20-some years after fire between the managed and the unmanaged wasn't necessarily the density of the trees, and even these size cost distributions look very similar. And the hardwoods one looked pretty similar too. I was surprised how closely they matched. The big difference really was how even those trees were spread across the stands on that. So what management did is really spread around and even out the conditions within the stand. And so I want to kind of shift the scales now from the stand level discussions that I covered up to now to looking a little more closely within stand and different components within stands. And so one of the studies we did a while back with ODF, we had various studies that looked at gaps, but one of the site projects that we started, just do a survey, how many gaps are there in a standard plantation or not? I mean, what is it, 5, 20, 30% or 10% or 0? So we actually took a bunch of air photos on the Oregon Coast Range. We kind of overlaid random lines, like you see here, the yellow line, and then we having the scale, we kind of looked at gaps where at least a 15-foot radius, we didn't see any conifers established on that. And when we looked at those stands, we found that, I guess at best, or if you think tree regeneration at first, you're looking at 6-8% of the stand was in open gaps on that. But those were the younger ones, and you don't find any of those big openings in the, those were the older ones, so you don't find any of the big openings in the younger stands on that. Sorry, I had it backwards. So pointing out that, the weed control practices, the nursery practices clearly have improved. We are now pretty efficient at establishing those stands that when you come back 5-10 years later, there is very little gaps left. And of course, one thing they did when they had a gap early on, they replanted on that. So very little in the standard operation, even if you shift scales. We did though find some gaps, of course, in those sites, and we did some analysis of the vegetation in it, and found kind of that it set up a lot of those sites, the gaps that were in the plantations, maybe a gopher hole, some root rot pocket, things like that, and that's where it did stay open for 15 or 20 years, and we did see the early cereal vegetation staking around for that long in that. Of course, eventually they'll close in, Douglas fir being, an aggressive grower in the Coast Range. In fact, the whole Coast Range is Douglas fir infested as far as I can tell. But you contrast that with conditions, of course, on the left where it stands, it's grown, and producing a lot of timber, and the discussions we had with ODF personnel to look at this almost like a biad. We have this big triad story on the landscape, parceling out the landscape with different objectives, and we kind of got to talk about that. You do have these potential gaps in it. If you don't replant, they will stick around for a little longer, and so maybe not maybe, but they can provide diversity within a standard plantation and kind of soften that stem exclusion phase on that. And hopefully, at least down the line, our studies hopefully will look at whether they become inoculation centers down the line to spread that early cereal vegetation in the mature forests. So we don't have to look at it as a plantation as one or the other on that. We can even break the plantation down, but part of it will focus on one aspect and part of it on the other. Just making a pitch of some of the things we're doing, we actually have now established some studies where we keep those young gaps open. So we went into 10, 15-year-old stands, looked for gaps and enlarged them and kind of look at gap closure. And we've gone the next step where we kind of tie the gaps into the stand. I guess I shouldn't really call it a landscape, but actually this was still before Matt was here with John Hayes, where we're looking at if we have these gaps in the stands, does wildlife notice the difference? So we went into fairly young plantation, 5 to 7 to 10-year-old, and put a quarter-acre gaps in it to the total of 6% of the area of the plantation. That study is ongoing. I was very pleased that I could talk them into 6% of the landscape to be set aside as a diversity, or as diversity islands, so to speak. At least that's what the lingo I used at the time. So we'll find out how many gaps we need, or when wildlife will notice a difference in terms of the gaps in the landscape. I want to switch now from management after the stand replacing disturbance, the partial disturbances. When I talk about partial disturbances, I'm talking about thinning operations like you see in the lower left here, and as well gaps like you see in the upper left, as two ways how we can deal with partial disturbances. And one thing we found, of course, when you look at the vegetation composition, actually 5 years after the thinning operations, you find we see quite a bit of increase in terms of number of species, and that increase is really driven by the early cereal species, by that gray component of the bar, which is really interesting enough. Initially, a lot of these thinning studies were set up to accelerate the development towards late successional conditions. So one of the things we do, at least in terms of composition, again, it's important to distinguish those two components, we shifted back to the early cereal ones. So when we look, I guess I just want to highlight a few things here. After thinning, again, you have the before thinning, all four plots were together here. After thinning, you see a separation, and the herb layer really benefited in terms of cover and expanded after the thinning operations. I'm not sure you need to worry about the different thinning treatments. They kind of align quite nicely anyway. The other thing I want to highlight, in the thinning operation, the tall shrub layer, really important, of course, as you heard from Joan, really lost out on it, dropped from over 40% to 10, 15, less than 20 on that. And 10 years later, it's still below. It still hasn't come up anywhere close to 40% on that. So those two things I want to stress. One thing that happened, I think, is just the physical harvesting damage on that knocked those shrubs down on that. And so it's really set back that shrub layer, and the herbs, I guess, in that sense, benefited from that. So if you think about carrying legacies around and tying this into management, one shift I've proposed in various settings is not to worry that much anymore about harvesting layout to minimize damage to residual trees. Those will be snags, and you can take some credit for those. But harvesting layout that looks at those advanced pockets or residual pockets, legacies of the early cereal vegetation, and protect those during the harvesting operation, especially since, as Joan pointed out, there is a time component, until the mosses are on it and the insects are on the mosses, and the birds can eat the insects. Another component that I want to point out here, in terms of the early cereal herbs, they were very responsive on that. You have on top the species richness, and at the bottom here, circled the cover. The left is the control, the right are three thinning operations. You can see the thinning operations nicely work in sync. They don't seem to distinguish much. But you see that herbs are really very dynamic. They can come in fairly quickly. The composition changes fairly quickly, and it changes towards early cereal forest. You don't see any changes. I guess you do also see some herbs here in the late cereal forest, but the main shift here is from the early cereal vegetation. So herbs will benefit from that. And again, looking a little bit closer at the shrubs on that, when in some of our settings, when we broke the shrubs down into late and early cereal, you see there was basically no early cereal shrub species there. We have the shrubs, but those were the legacies, the late cereal ones on that. So, keeping in mind, again, when we separate structure and function, we get that shrub layer as part of the early cereal structure, but we don't see necessarily a shift in species composition, at least when we deal with our partial disturbances, our thinning operations. And last, I guess one more thing I want to point out here. After our thinning operations, again, you have control conditions here on the left, and the other ones are different thinning intensity as part of the density management study. 11 years later, we still have quite a few early cereal species sticking around. Up to 30% on average of the canopy cover is early cereal species. So these thinnings were maybe a little more intense. Certainly, I guess the more you go to the right, the more intense they were. So there is a benefit for going more intense in the thinning operations. I guess there are some gaps in this one as well, I should mention. So a decade at least, we do have quite a bit of that vegetation around. The other thing I should point out, to me the amazing, maybe more amazing, is in the control. Now these are 50, 60-year-old stands, we had 15% cover of early xero species. So there is some legacy in certain gaps. That spatial variability, I assume, will kind of be responsible for something like that. I just added this sitting in the back when the discussion came about flowering on that. And just pointing out, actually, when Brianna Lind and Pat Muir looked at that, they found that thinning operations actually, maybe I should say, it doesn't take as much canopy opening to encourage flowering as clear-cut would provide. Even partial openings encourage flowering. If you look at it here, make sure I get that right. The left one is just the frequency. The one in the middle is the abundance, and then they have the flowering on the right. So if you look at it, just about any time they had some of these species around here, there's 4 species they listed, it did also flower on that. So there is the benefit to flowering, at least, seems to be quite possible to achieve with partial harvesting or partial thinning operations on that. Of course, you do also see a big benefit of flowering in the late xero things as well. Last point I want to make when we talk about gaps, I know when we looked at the gaps, clearly they are the conditions where you really get that early xero vegetation in. And we talked about gap size. I know Tom mentioned the 1-to-1 ratio. I think for most of our forests, based on our assessment, I think if you're under an acre, you're probably missing out on something, or you're looking at very short-term benefits. Clearly, our quarter-acre plots showed that the benefits were very short-term on that. I think the 1 acre kind of multiplies out closer to the 1-to-1 in that sense anyway, so that fits quite nicely on that. But also what we find, at least the first couple of years, the first 5 and 10 years, the benefit of opening up this gap in terms of switching species composition is really limited to the extent of the gap. It doesn't infiltrate the forest and move out and change the vegetation in the surrounding parts of the stand. It was really right where the trees started, the vegetation changed and reflected that interior forest condition. And one of the suggestions that came up is that was part of the impact there was just the physical disturbance of harvesting. Basically the site preparation, if you want to call it that, through the harvesting operation. And so the adjacent forest didn't have that. So in order to encourage some of this early xeral vegetation, as Tom already pointed out, you got to remove the canopy, but in this case there's real benefit from also disturbing the lower vegetation and exposing some mineral soil. So it was that mineral soil exposure, that physical disturbance, in combination with the higher light environment that seemed to shift the species. And the light environment that kind of showed quite nicely that at least in the larger gaps, we clearly had a different response in the northern end and the southern end. So the northern end, where we got more light, clearly showed a more shift in species composition to early xero. I saw you getting up, so I'm jumping right to the conclusion on that. I just kind of a brief summary. Again, as we kind of discuss our management, to me it's really important to distinguish the structure and the process, the composition on that. It's also important to distinguish short-term versus longer-term impacts of our management. I guess we'll hear about that a little bit more with the songbirds, where different stages support different songbirds. But even with the vegetation, what keeps things open early on, if you have conifers in the mix, may accelerate the development down the line away from it. When you think about legacy, think about all the good they do, but also think about what they do to the vegetation, and sometimes they may not do what you want out of them in terms of shifting vegetation development on that. The last, I guess, pitch I want to make is the idea of scale. We don't have to choose one or the other. The variability within the stand that, at least in traditional silviculture, we have ignored. In fact, stands are defined as homogeneous units. I think shifting our thinking away from that, looking for opportunities, especially opportunities that nature provides, at least when we dealt with ODF, the idea that you don't have to come back into your plantation and replant if you have a failure. In fact, that you may go the other way and make sure you keep that gap open, provide some real opportunities. I think I'll leave it at that. Any questions or comments on that?
Quick one.  1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1.
Actually, well, two things. We have studies where we have a quarter acre and a 1 acre gap, and we did the comparison. Actually, we have quarter, half, and 1, and we did the quarter and 1 acre comparison, and have documented the differences in terms of vegetation development and composition between that. And there's a real, if you want to, especially long-term development, there's real benefit to keeping it open and going with the larger gaps. We did see an increase in early serial vegetation, but it was quite limited in the small gaps. The John Hayes study, I should point out, I guess he's not working with us anymore. He's now in Florida, big-time administrator. But we put those we only have quarter acre gaps in that study, and we put it in 5-6-year-old plantations. And so in that sense, for that study, we won't have the comparison on that. We have to rely on other studies to provide us that. And it was tough enough to convince foresters to go in and cut 6-year-old Douglas fir to make openings on that. So the quarter acre was as much as I could push it on in that aspect. But I think in general, when you look through it, when we look through where the vegetation changes come from, it comes from the extremes on that. So if you really want to push diversity, you got to go to the extremes. So you got to go beyond the thinning to the gaps and to the larger gaps on that. Especially if you can come in every 5 to 10 years and maybe enlarge it as you see need.